Hi, my name is Kaihan Krippendorff. I'm an author and a speaker on innovation and strategy. And in today's episode, what we're going to talk about is the idea that employees are really the innovators that have transformed the world more so than entrepreneurs.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Well, one of the key answers, of course, is innovation. But where is the fastest place to tap into innovation? Well, stay tuned because that's exactly what you're going to discover on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I am the Dragonist, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. To find out more about me, you can simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our 2-hour live Dragon leadership trainings that are now being made available to you. Imagine being in a virtual classroom where I personally walk you through the techniques and strategies that are previously only offered to the top CEOs and C-suite executives, high-level entrepreneurs, athletes, and entertainers. Well, now you have that opportunity. You can simply go to dovbaron.com. You can click on that menu bar and you'll see where it says 2-hour training. Go there. And as you join us, in fact, you'll actually get access to past episodes on subjects like ethical persuasion, becoming a meaning-driven leader, resilient leadership in times of chaos, and more. Go to dovbaron.com now and secure your seat. Also, remember that you can chat about this episode or any past episode inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you tune into podcasts. If you're a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show over time. We're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Agility, resilience, innovation. These are all words that are thrown around without much consideration of them as sort of tappable resources. Leaders often feel as if being the leader, they must be the wellspring of innovation. But is that true? If it's not, what are the barriers to innovation? Well, let's find out, because our guest on this episode is Kaihan Krippendorff. Now, he is a best-selling author of Driving Innovation from Within. He is recognized by the Thinkers 50 as one of the 8 most influential innovation thought leaders in the world. His ideas have already generated over 2.5 billion in revenue to date. Now, here's what Nobel Prize winner Mohammad Yunus said about Kaihan. He said, Kaihan shows that with a compelling idea, anyone can change the world. That message, of course, has made him one of the most sought-after speakers on the topic of business strategy, growth, transformation, and, of course, innovation. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome the author of Driving Innovation from Within, Mr. Kaihan Krippendorff.
Thank you. I want to record that intro, and I'm going to have it played before every time I speak. That was awesome.
Well, how about you just have it played every time you enter the room?
Yes. That'll be my soundtrack.
What will your kids be like?
Yeah.
I really appreciate you.
Yeah.
Friends come over for coffee,
Yes, I just carry that around in my, I'll just carry around on a speaker and just like have it follow.
Exactly. Bluetooth speaker in your pocket.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad for you to be here, mate. It's really good.
You.
You know, we were talking recently about how the fact that you and I had shared the stage, and it's almost 4 years ago.
Was it?
Back in
Yeah.
Chicago.
It feels
Wow.
like further back than that, but yeah, it was.
Yeah, that's true. Because about a week ago feels like 4 years ago these days.
That's right. Yeah,
And
time is accelerating.
and of course, you interviewed me on one of your shows.
Hmm.
Where we like to start our show is in these sort of times of thought leaders and all that, those titles that get thrown around. Who might be someone that we may have never considered or maybe even never heard of who's been a major influence on you and on your leadership?
Well, you know, my topic is strategy and innovation. That's where I'm really deep. I listen to lots of different things and read lots of different types of books. But, you know, for strategy, I don't know if you've had Rita McGrath on. She's written most recently Seeing Around Corners, and before that, The End of Competitive Advantage. And she was a student of Clayton Christensen. And what I love about her work is that she is very much in company. She actually does the work. So it is not only theory, it's theoretically and research based, but really practical insights and tips. So that's someone. I also got a chance to interview her along with Navi Raju, who is a columnist. I don't know if you've had him or you know him, but his book, most recent book, is Frugal Innovation. And he's got just some inspiring stories of in developing countries where there are few resources, how people are forced to think creatively and innovate, not because they have the resources, but because they don't have the resources. Those are two of my favorites.
Yeah, it's interesting because you know the old saying, right? That necessity is the mother of invention, and
Right.
I think that that's very true. There's that wonderful story about the I think there's actually a Netflix show about it right now about a kid who created wells in Africa.
Yes,
You know,
in Malawi. Yes.
yeah, you know, it's pretty cool stuff. And again,
Yeah.
it's, you know, from bicycle parts and bits
Yes.
and bobs.
Yes.
And you know, we often get frustrated that the internet goes down for 8 seconds, or that we have a 1 second wait on something, and then you have people like that just doing amazing things. Pretty
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, my mom lived in Malawi for a few years, and
Really?
I went there, yeah, for like 3 years, and I spent a couple summers there. So as soon as that came out, I made sure to watch it.
No, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we ask, because I know that people want to ask? Your name is unusual,
Mm-hmm.
and it suggests several cultures. So but let's get that out of the way.
Yeah. So my mom is from Bangladesh, and I think that she chose my first name because the name is Farsi from Iran, and maybe they're both Muslim countries. I don't really have a good answer for why that name. My father's German, so Krippendorff is my last name. That means crib town in German. So that's my background.
Do you know what Kaihan means?
Yes, it means universe in Farsi. So
Nice.
the national newspaper of Iran is the Kaihan, is how it's pronounced. And so I guess it kind of means the globe, I would say, but it means universe.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, just not much to live with, right? You represent
I know.
the universe.
Well, I know.
No pressure at all.
No pressure. I can't fill up the universe, so I've no aspirations to even try.
So the name of the book is Driving Innovation from Within. It's a guide for internal entrepreneurs. So talk to us a little bit about that, because as I was saying in the intro, I think that a lot of leaders feel like they're supposed to be the wellspring of innovation. Right. And you really discovered something quite different with your research. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I quit my job. I was working at McKinsey in 2004, and when I wrote my first book, and then for the next decade, my work was really about, and my doctorate work is really about, what are the patterns, the thinking patterns that reveal breakthrough strategic ideas. And so I study people like Mohammad Yunus and look at what are the mechanics behind thinking differently, thinking
Mhm.
strategically. And so often what comes up when I do my work, and I would do this with large companies, with Microsoft, United Technologies, and Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, go in and do these ideation sessions, if you will. But often what comes up is, hey, this was a great idea, great experience, but you know what? It's never going to happen here, because in big companies, we've got the bureaucracy, we've got the culture, we've got the legacy, and to be an innovator, you really need to quit your job and be an entrepreneur. And I didn't want to believe that.
Right.
And, you know, my wife is an executive at MasterCard, and she is smart and passionate and creative. And so many of my friends are in these big companies. And honestly, it sort of pissed me off a little bit, the narrative that,
Mhm.
oh, the big, slow companies, right? So I tested it out, and I've got a bunch of proof points. But what I can show you is, if you look at the most transformative innovations of recent decades, like the internet, like email, like DNA sequencing,
Right.
what you find is 70% of those innovations were conceived of by employees, not by entrepreneurs. And so if we think that through, if it were true that entrepreneurs are the primary innovators, and I'm an entrepreneur and I work with entrepreneurs, I love entrepreneurs, but if it weren't possible for employees to innovate, you would not wake up in the morning and have a mobile phone to reach for. You couldn't connect that to the internet. You couldn't send an email. If you got sick, you couldn't get a stent. You couldn't get an MRI. We would live in a dramatically inferior world if it weren't for the fact that employees in large organizations are innovators. And so this book has really been, it took me 5 years to write this book, interviewed 150 internal innovators. My mission here is to flip that narrative and to say it's not an anomaly that
Mhm.
someone inside a company comes up with something cool that changes the world. It is the norm, you know?
So that's interesting. So why do you think that myth is so strong? I
It's,
mean, I know that I can kind of get why it's strong about entrepreneurs, because that gets news. Okay,
yes.
I get that.
Yeah.
But why do you think it's such a myth the other way? That, do you think it's just because the employees get swallowed up in the voice of the big company? What is it?
Yeah, I think it's a good excuse to not try, to
Mm.
be able to say, hey, I could do this, but it's not possible, so I'm not going to try. You know, I could lose weight, but nobody's ever lost weight, so I'm not going to try. Something like that, right?
Mm.
And it stems also from the stickiness of that hero story of the entrepreneur that
Mm.
dominates, right? That that hero's journey. If you take a list of most innovative business people, what you will see towards the top of the list, excuse me, what you'll see at the top of the list is Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, the Google guys, the Airbnb guys. And if you line them up and you look at them, one thing you'll notice that they're all white men.
That's
And
true.
so there's an issue there. The second thing you'll notice is that they
Go on.
all they got an idea in college, right? And then they make the journey.
Mhm.
They go from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? And then they go into the cave. The hero always goes all by
Always goes
on
into
his
the
own
dark
into the
cave.
cave. And in this case, the cave is what? The garage,
Yes.
right? And then they come out of the garage and they bring out their innovation, and it disrupts the world. So the consistency of that story has to make you question if the story is true.
Mm.
And so I think we just love telling that story. If you want to sell a podcast, if you want to sell an article, if you want to sell a TV show, you're going to get more eyeballs and more interest if you talk about the entrepreneur. People, the true story of innovation is much more complicated. It's usually not one person that takes it all the way through. They've got a baton, they pass it off to someone else, and often by the time the innovation makes it to the market, you don't even know who that original innovator was.
But isn't that part of the American myth? I mean, the American business myth, the you can make it kind of mentality. I mean, I think that every one of those stories is part of the mythology that is part of the American dream.
Yes. No, it's
So
true.
of course it does very well. I don't know that story does as well in Sweden. I don't know if that's story does as well even in the UK. I don't know
Mhm.
if that story does as well even in Australia. Certainly
Yeah.
not in Africa, maybe not in India or Thailand.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
it's, it's
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
that it
Yeah.
ties into that.
It does. It does. And when you do talk about large scale innovation, large organization innovation, it's not as sexy to talk about the company. And what people often default to then is the creator of the original entrepreneur that created the company or the CEO of the company. Like we
Right.
want to be able to point to someone and say, this was Steve Jobs' idea, right? It's easier to point to that than to talk about the complexity of the culture and leadership practices and talent and organizational structures that create the context for great stuff to come out of a company.
But then when we come to talking about the company, we another a myth that got broken very recently in early 2020 was this idea. I mean, the reason we can't talk about innovation inside of a company is because you can't turn a company, you can't turn the ship on a dime. It's a big ocean liner, you can't turn it on a dime.
Mm-hmm.
And then the pandemic happened and companies literally turned on a dime within 21 days,
Yeah.
which for a large company is insanely fast.
Yes.
Companies who could never go remote were suddenly 100%
100%.
remote. So I think that many ways the pandemic has become maybe the proof of your very theory. The innovation is within.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it reveals the central dilemma of large company innovation, which is, as Clayton Christensen pointed out, that you do well by the old model, and it is easier to say, well, let's just keep doing what we've done before. It's not that we can't do the new thing, but I think Machiavelli, I'm not going to get this quote exactly right, but he says there's nothing more difficult than bringing something new into the world, because the innovator has lukewarm defenders and people who may do well under the new system and strong opponents in those who are doing well in the old system. So
Yeah.
it is a psychological dilemma. It's about beliefs and our attachment to beliefs. It's not about what's actually possible, what's physically possible.
Yeah. Well, as Werner Heisenberg said, sometimes you have to wait for the old guard to die in order
Yes.
for the change to take place. It's
Yes.
not that it's not possible. It's just that there's so much frickin' resistance and
Yes.
attachment to what was.
Yes.
Now, in the book, you talk about the 7 barriers to employee innovation. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that that's a really important, it extends from what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So I really take a look from the employee's viewpoint. So like the
Yeah.
bottom up rather than the top down, but the
Yeah.
implication for the top down as well. So I interview 150 internal innovators. I ask each of them, what do you see as the number one or the 2 or 3 big barriers that you need to overcome, and how do you overcome them? And I line them up, and there's 7 that pop out. And just to make them easy to remember, I forced it to spell innovate, INOVATE. I'm not saying this is like a magic, but it's just easy to remember.
Sure.
So intent is where it begins, actually having the intent to innovate and believing it's possible. The next is, after you've activated people's intent, it is, what does the market and company need? 55% of mid-level managers can't name 2 of their company's top strategic priorities. So you often will hear a CEO say, well, I ask people for ideas, but the ideas they come up with are not good ideas. They're not strategic. Well, of course not. They don't even know what your strategy is. So that's need. And then if you get through need, there's options, which is the habit of creating lots and lots and lots of ideas, a portfolio of options, as opposed to falling in love with that one idea.
Right.
And the next thing I call value blockers, but you could really think of it as business model conflict. So, we need to train people to be creative in designing the business models around our ideas. And you might have an idea and there is a logical customer for that idea, but then you find out that that's not a customer that your sales force currently meets with. So now you have business model conflict. So you've got to have the wherewithal to redesign the business model to remove that conflict. That's value blockers.
Right.
Next is taking action on the idea. Often established companies ask you to prove an idea,
Yes.
before they'll let you take action. But for new ideas, you often have to do the opposite. You have to take action in order to prove the idea, right? Like
Mhm.
HP, it tried to prove that there was a market for the first electronic calculator. And the market research firm that they hired came back and said, there's no market for this because there already is an entrenched competitor in the market that has a price point that is radically lower than your price point. Why would anyone want to give up a slide rule for an electronic calculator, right? So you can't prove there's a market because no one's ever seen it before. So what did they do? They made 1,000 of them, they put it on the market, and then before long they were selling 1,000 a day. So taking action. That brings us to T, which is team. And the challenge in a large company is the team that you need to put together doesn't all report to the same person. You need someone from operations, you need someone from marketing, you need someone from finance, you need someone from HR. And unless you get the CEO to tell all of them to work together, you need to kind of create this informal cohort of people to collectively pursue the idea. And then the last thing is E for environment, and that is the organizational barriers, the leadership, the structures, the talent, and the culture that get in the way of innovation. So INOVATE. And I think if we can just train people in each of these 7 things, E would be political acumen. These successful internal innovators, they actually love the politics and train people to enjoy the political challenge of pursuing an innovation. And not see it as something that's wrong. As an example, now we can really liberate organizations, liberate people in organizations to create the great stuff so that we have the next MRI, so we have the next internet.
But, I mean, obviously these are the barriers. And so I'm thinking of, again, not as particularly as somebody at the top, but somebody who's in that mid or upper middle range who sees this innovative idea. And let's just take the one around action. I can't prove it until we take action, but nobody's going to give me permission to take action. So just to take that one as an example, if I'm in that place and I see this thing, what do I do? Because a lot of what you've talked about seems like stop, 7 stops, really, rather than 7 goes.
Yeah, no, there are ways around each of them. And
I'm sure.
Yeah, what I see for action, for example, is often they don't ask permission and they gear down that first action that they need to take. We talked about frugal innovation earlier. They
Yes.
create a very frugal test. And they, 3M, for example, their entire heritage is based off of the same story, which is I came up with an idea. My boss said no. I went into my garage or my basement. I made it, and then I showed it to them, and then they said yes. That's what gave us masking tape. That's what gave us the Post-it note, right? And so there is this pattern of I've got this idea, and instead of going to my boss and saying, hey, boss, can I have 3 days a week and $100,000 to work on it? No, don't even ask your boss. Just find a very inexpensive test. A lot of our clients like this idea from Michael Schrage, who wrote the Innovator's Hypothesis of a 5-5-5 experiment. 5 people, $5,000, 5 weeks, 1 or 2 days a week, run an experiment. And, it's unlikely that your company is going to be upset for you risking $5,000.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I find that the biggest barrier is ego. And the ego is, I'm in charge, so you don't get to do that unless I tell you you can do it. And I'm telling you you can't. Because if you do, I may not look as good as I do right now. So, no. And of course, I think that oftentimes, because, as you know, that I'm dealing with those senior level people, my experience is a lot of the times they just don't know. It's almost like the old metaphor of the gatekeeper, you and I want to meet the CEO, but we got to get through the gatekeeper. And these are the gatekeepers of innovation. You know what I mean? They block the innovation from getting past.
Yes. Yeah. We organize this peer group of chief strategy officers of billion-dollar-plus businesses. And what comes out often is this idea that there is in the middle of the organization, there is this concrete bar
Mhm.
of those gatekeepers, right? And where they are in their careers, they don't want to take a risk. And
No.
so the top people want the innovation, they want the ideas, they want the engagement, and the bottom people want it. But you're right, there's that gatekeeper issue right in the middle.
So that which naturally brings me to the conversation of how can you or I or whoever as a CEO set up a cultural environment that facilitates these innovations? How do we
Yep.
bring that in? How do we set that up to I mean the gatekeepers are there for a reason,
Hmm.
although it may be somewhat inflated. Um, how do we set up that culture?
Yeah, I think there's certain cultural norms that are proven to be foundational for creating that kind of culture, and those include things like strong customer centricity, awareness of the market,
Hmm.
the willingness to take risks, but not really expensive risk, but create risk asymmetry.
Hmm.
That includes the willingness to be proactive and not asking permission necessarily ahead of time. So there are certain like foundational things that you can change. Now, how do you change that culture? I think the easiest way for leadership is to put a few organizational uh, uh, I don't know what they call it, like systems in place, let's say. The first is there resources? Are there resources to invest in innovation? Do we have a 5-5-5 experiment program? Could someone get a day a week of their time to do something? That's something you can implement that as a policy. What are the costs of failure? When someone fails, does it hurt their career or does it promote their career? Do we value the learning that comes from trying something and failing? And the third one would be how can you create cross-functional teaming? How can you create a structure where, as I said before, someone in marketing can team up with someone in operations and they can do something together? Those are three simple things. You can identify if you are not allowing those things and create a program outside of the normal performance management structure in order to enable those things. Of
So are
course, the
these sort of
easiest thing to
mini
do.
skunk works?
Yeah, so because the easiest thing to do is to create a skunk works and create a separate organization. I personally feel like skunk works are a great first step, but when you
Hmm.
create a skunk work, you you risk creating this dialogue of, if you're in the skunk work, we're asking you to innovate. But what does that mean for everyone who's not in the skunk works now,
Right.
right? And if we want to really liberate, empower our people to pursue the innovations, because they're the people on the phone with customers in the call centers that hear the pain points and the needs. If we're not asking them to innovate, then we're hurting our organizations and we're hurting engagement. And so I believe much more in moving to a model of everyone innovating. You can kind of think of it this way: there's you either have everyone innovate or a few people innovate, and then you either have one big pocket of money or you have pockets of money from all the P&Ls. And
Hmm.
so the skunk work model usually is a few people innovating and one big pocket of money. This is the Google X model.
Yeah,
And so it's good to have that. But I think
sure.
that you should also have the everyone innovates and you need to get the money from the P&Ls, do that frugal innovation. So you can do all four.
See, I totally get where you're coming from, and I think it's a great concept. I'm just thinking about the resistance. I'm just thinking about that massive resistance of at the bottom end, they won't listen to me. In the middle, you don't get to innovate unless I tell you I give you permission. And at the top, I'm blind. I don't know that it's not even happening. Right. So
Yep. Yep.
this must be what you have confronted, what you have researched and found around, because I'm sure there are companies who are doing it very, very well. So who are some companies that we might recognize who are doing exactly what you've laid out in this fabulous book, that are a great example of that?
Well, I looked at there are 350 odd companies that have appeared on Forbes or Fast Company's most innovative lists.
Hmm.
And I look at their performance and I said, if you're innovating, if successfully, you should be outperforming your peers. You should either be growing faster, have higher profit margins, or higher shareholder value. And what I found, there are only 13 companies that meet that criteria. So most companies are doing what some people call innovation theater. It looks like innovation, but it's not really effective. So the ones that aren't doing that are companies like Alibaba, like Amazon, like MasterCard and Visa, Netflix, for example. And you see that they take very much a broad everyone innovate approach, and they've got just specific policies that allow people to be innovative. A lot of it stems from just strategic questions like, what business are we in? Like MasterCard does not consider itself a payments company. It considers itself a technology company, and it is a technology company that's creating a better world. Amazon doesn't consider itself a retailer. Otherwise, it would never have launched Amazon Web Services. It sees itself defined by being Earth's most customer-centric organization. And so it stems, I think, from that question of who are we. Now, once you define who you are, then you start behaving differently. Starbucks is also on that list. I got a chance to talk to the former president of Starbucks, Howard Behar. He's Howard Schultz's right-hand man for much of the rise. And I asked him, what was the big idea? And he said, it was the moment that we realized that our customers were not people like you and me that come in to buy coffee. No, our customers are our employees. Now, if we take that as a lens, and now someone says, hey, Dove, let's give everyone health care. Because the United States, we don't have universal health care. Let's give even part-time workers health care. Now, if you are in the coffee business, you think, well, that's a cost. If you are in the people business, that starts making sense, right? And so they were one of the first companies to do that. The first companies to give stock to all of their employees. So you start really behaving differently, and these thousands of decisions. The former CEO of Best Buy, Hubert Joly, he is a quote, I'm going to get this exactly right, but leadership is not about the quality of decisions, it is about the quantity of decisions. And so when you start making those thousands and thousands of small decisions, they all multiply and really create a force. Another company you can look at is Haier in Asia. They are an appliance maker. They bought GE appliances. They took their hierarchy and they broke it down into 4,000 micro enterprises. Each one has its own CEO. The CEO can get voted out if he's not or she's not doing a good job. Finance, HR, IT, all of those are separate organizations. They have to sell their services internally. And if people stop buying, if people say, you know what, I don't like the IT service that our internal IT department is buying, I'm going to go outsource it to Deloitte or to Accenture, they can do that. And so it really makes it is a company filled with CEO entrepreneurs. So there are some radical things you can do, and there's some small things you can do.
That is, I mean, I love that, because that is some serious innovation.
Yeah.
Because I've been talking for years, you've been talking for years, we've all been talking about this, those of us at the cutting edge, about how the hierarchy of leadership is dead, and we've got to stop doing from the top down command and control.
Yeah.
But what that looks like and how we do it, and blah, blah, blah. And then you've got a company like you were just talking about with how many CEOs? 4,000. 4,000 CEOs. I mean, who doesn't want that on their business card if they're an employee? That's
true.
one.
That's true.
So there's an aspirational piece that motivates people. And then there is also the understanding of a responsibility, and that you can be moved out very quickly of that position. But it also puts the power of decision-making with the people who actually can have it. Because so often, again, what we started on here, so often the people at the top don't listen to the people at the bottom, and the people at the bottom who are having the customer-facing experience and get the experience. It's fascinating. You talked about Amazon. Amazon and Apple, for me, fantastic companies for how they serve the customer. Terrible companies for how they serve the provider. Doing stuff with Apple as a provider, terrible, pain in the butt. I do exactly the same with Amazon. Pain in the ass. Can't get it through to anybody. I have to read all this tiny fine print. It's pain. But as a customer, I love them. I love how they serve me as a customer. It's a fascinating, it's like, damn, you've got a big hole there. So it's interesting that whoever deals with that side doesn't have that. And again, I don't know the people. Yep. I don't know who it is, but it's an interesting thing because clearly what they've done has worked spectacularly well at a customer level, and at a provider level, everybody I know is frustrated.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think we need to judge them also not only on their performance and their customer, but all stakeholders. What is their net contribution to society? So I think it is important to think about how they also treat their vendors. There's a framework that Tom Malone, he's an MIT Sloan professor, and he has a framework that just really stuck with me. He said there are 5 ways that humans make decisions collectively: hierarchies, democracies, marketplaces, communities, and ecosystems. And we think our organization is a hierarchy. But if we look at how work actually gets done, there are all 5 of those in place. So your culture shapes your community. You have an internal marketplace of talent where the best people get the best jobs, right? You have a democracy, if you will, at the very top, because you've got boards that are elected by shareholders that vote, and so if you take all of the main decisions and look at which of those 5 is the best structure for making those decisions, you can start rethinking your structure. And it's not just it's the end of bureaucracy, it's the end of hierarchy, we're going to become something new. You have 5 feet in all 5 of those, I think.
That is really quite fascinating. You founded the Outthinkers Strategy Network.
Yes.
A community comprised of strategy executives. You were talking about that a few minutes ago. And these are people from the largest corporations, right?
Yeah,
Can you tell us a
billion-dollar
little bit
plus
about
businesses.
this and how it helped?
Yeah, it started off as, when I was really doing consulting work, it started off as a client development activity. And what we found is that we were creating more value by bringing together these peers of strategists together to talk to each other and talk to thought leaders. And so the way it works is it's invitation only, billion-dollar plus business. You lead strategy. We don't let CEOs join, because this is really about the very lonely role of strategy. And they pick topics that they care about. And then we go and look for a thought leader who knows a lot about that topic. So for example, we have next week, they really want to talk about AI and platform business models. So we have a professor from Harvard Business School coming. They want to talk about deal making, with the recent COVID, reality. Their M&A pipeline is diminishing because you often need to have personal conversations with someone that you're acquiring, get that personal sense of culture fit, and they're closing the deals that with deals where they knew the other party personally. Those are kind of, they're not creating any more new deals. So that's something we're going to talk about. So so that's what it is, and actually things moving virtually for us has really accelerated that for us, because we used to do the in-person sessions in New York and Boston. We're starting to do in Miami as well, but now we are able to do it virtually. So we have people joining from all over the world now.
Fascinating, because it's that's what I was going to ask you. Do you find that the world having gone remote in 2020, do you find that has had a lot of impact on internal innovation, the entrepreneur? Do you feel like that has given birth to a lot of that? Do you think that companies have gotten better at listening because of that?
I think it has shifted people to look for internal people-driven innovation away from the formal programs, because many companies right now, they've got their incubation team or their skunk works, and those people are working on something that's going to be released in 3 to 5 years, and now there's less of an appetite to focus on the long term. And there are lots of interesting mini pivots available that employees see, and if they can do little things to pivot, seize little opportunities, that's what's going to fuel companies innovating out of the crisis. So yeah, that's what I see.
Right, because you've talked about all these mechanisms. Do you see that there is a specific way to come up with disruptive ideas, or do you think it's sort of, is it nebulous, or is it necessity driven, or do you think there is a formula?
I think there's a formula, and it has to do, there are kind of 5 different steps, if you will, but if I were to simplify it, it is about taking patterns from other domains, abstracting them, and applying them here. And the patterns are things like playing for tomorrow rather than today. Another pattern is what we talked about with Howard Bihar and Starbucks, not defining yourself by your industry, but defining yourself by something else, like a purpose or capability that has you make decisions differently. You put that lens on and say, well, what does this kind of company do differently? A big pattern is coordinating the uncoordinated. When we talk about platform business models and blockchain, and a lot of these things are just part of an overall macro pattern where power less often comes from control, but increasingly from coordination. I think be good is another big one, that organizations realize that there's a smarter strategy is to create a situation in which your growth is good for the world rather than just shareholders. Right. And then another one I call create something out of nothing, which is the idea of creating new customers, creating new categories, creating new needs. So you can take these patterns, and for COVID, there's a different set of patterns, but you take these patterns and you ideate them. And when you ideate, you separate the ideation of the ideas from the consideration of the ideas. So you take these, generate 50, 100 ideas, and then you look at them and say, which ones are really disruptive? Which are the ones that competitors are going to ignore and laugh at?
Yeah, but I think that a lot of the things that the competitors would laugh at, of course, have become the things that will change the world.
Yes.
And it is that laziness and that complacency and all those kinds of things. I talked about recently that in a training I did on creativity and the power of creativity and the importance of creativity, and in a world of business where we've often shamed creativity. If your dad was the CEO and you said you want to be an artist, your dad might have shamed you for that idea. And now your dad, being the CEO, is looking for artists to be the innovators inside of the organization, because the artist colors outside of the lines. And that idea is so important, yet there is that internal battle again of that, well, we've got to do things in a certain way. And, as you said before, people want to cling to what was familiar, but the world has, we know the world is, that we can use this statement, the world has changed. We could use that at any point in time, in any point in history, and it would be true, but it's never more true than it is right now, because it was as we talked about, it was a 21-day pivot from the world we knew to a completely different world. And when people talk about, when we get back to normal, well, normal's already over, it's finished. So what does it take for a company to remain relevant in this fast-paced, digital-based future? What do you think it's going to take?
Yeah, I think that it's important to recognize that this isn't a one-time pivot. It is part of that we are entering, and we have been entering that VUCA world, that some people call it, and that it's less about just pivoting now. It is about having the agility to see, sense, and pivot regularly. right?
Mm.
And so those are the companies that are going to survive. American Express, they pivoted 3 or 4 times in their history. They
Mhm.
started off delivering packages, and then they pivoted and they did what are they called, traveler's checks, and then they
Yep.
pivoted to credit cards, right? But they did that over many decades. Now we're gonna have to do it much more frequently. So I think that if we take those innovate steps that I mentioned, what we're going to start seeing is under I, intent, we're going to start seeing companies not looking at their people as employees, but rather as entrepreneurs. In
Right.
order to have them understand the need, we're going to take these complex strategic plans that no one can understand and narrow them down to very simple statements of purpose.
Right.
Options, ideas aren't going to come from the boardroom anymore. They're going to come from the hallways.
Mhm.
Value blockers, we're going to see organizations not holding on to one business model, but rather seeing the business as an ecosystem of many business models. For
Right.
ACT, we're going to allow people to start teaming across silos. For ACT, we're going to allow them to just take action, not ask them for a business plan, not ask them for a financial projection. And then team, we're going to allow them to start teaming across silos. And in environment, I really think we're going to see organizations evolve from top-down hierarchies to platforms where
Yes.
people are free to seek readily resources to pursue and realize opportunities for the better of their companies. And at the center of all this, you need to be a company that your people love, that people
Yes.
want to do it for the company, right?
Yeah. As I wrote about in my last book, the need for community
Mm-hmm.
is inherent in human beings, but it must be inherent in the company. And that is not a foosball machine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
It is the B Corp. It is the corporation that is about being better, being good, making a
Yes.
difference in the world that I want to be part of, not just to sell my hours to, but
Yes.
to bind my soul to is a
Yes.
much more important piece.
Yes.
I think that for all of us, and it's my belief, it's not the truth. My belief is that we do in the world what we needed to learn to do for ourselves. We are here to heal a part of ourselves,
Yes.
and we often, strategically find a way to do that. And when you talk about this entrepreneurial mentality, this innovation that's coming from within, where did you fail at that brought you to this place of going, shit, that's the problem? Because I think the mirror is a great teacher
Yeah.
when we
Yeah.
eventually look in it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I've failed, often. And I think for me, and going through this, I looked at what took me so long to start focusing on this. This is the first book that for me is truly a passion, because my mission is to liberate employees to be able to express themselves. My purpose in life is people loving what they do, people living lives of full self-expression and
Mm-hmm.
passion. And I really danced around that in my other books. Outthink the Competition kind of touched on that. The Art of the Advantage, The Way of Innovation, I didn't really like put myself into it. It wasn't a personal mission. And so, you know, you talk often about like bringing yourself to work, bringing
Yeah,
your humanity to work.
yeah, absolutely.
And I was not really doing that authentically. And I think if had I done that earlier, I think, I would have written this book earlier, and I'm just so passionate about what I do now and this message. And so that's something that I've learned.
Right. Now, this last book won Edison Award. It was award nominated, I think.
Hmm. Hmm.
What
Yeah.
what what like you talked about, this book is different for you.
Yeah.
But what drives you to write books? Why do you
Hmm.
bother? I mean, anybody who's ever written a book, and I've written a few, and you've written a few, and we all know it's a birthing process,
Hmm.
like any birthing process.
Painful. Yes.
The getting pregnant is really fun, because
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I've got this great idea, but then carrying that beast and birthing it is something else altogether.
Yeah. A lot of people ask, like, they who want to write a book, they ask me for advice. I like writing books, though. I don't write a book for a purpose. I would love to just write and never give another talk or do another consulting project. I wouldn't mind if I was just in a hole and was just writing and researching. In fact, just the other day, like last Friday, I block off Fridays for primarily for writing, and I just did not want to write. And I thought of all these other things I could do. And I said, okay, I've got 3 hours, my 7 hours of writing now gone to 3 hours. I've wasted so much time. You can turn off your phone, turn on some music. And I just started typing. At the end of 3 hours, I was just so energized. And that is a sign, I think, that you're doing something that you love. So I love it.
You just said that resistance is there, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Right? And that's one of the things I'm always saying to people. I know, because I face it myself, that I have resistance to doing the thing I love. And nobody gets that, because they think people who love what they do, it must be easy. You just step into it. No, I have resistance. My ego is in the way of that. And I have to push through that resistance, not by discipline. It's got nothing to do with discipline. For me, it's about focusing on what matters, focusing on meaning. And when I go, okay, I don't want to really do this. I want to distract myself with 20,000 other things. But this is what matters. This is the meaning of my life. Yes. And I push through that resistance, and then the energy comes.
Yes, I agree. One of my favorite books is The War of Art. Not
Great
The Art
book.
of War. Amazing. And I love, I'm forgetting the...
Stephen Penfield.
Penfield, right. There's one quote in which he describes a great writer that was asked a question: do you write when you're inspired, or do you write when you have to write?
I know,
and he said,
so
I'm not going to get exactly right, but he said, I write when I'm inspired. Luckily, that happens at 9 a.m. every morning.
Exactly.
Just sit down and do the work. That resistance, that war between you and the resistance that's keeping you from doing what matters, as you said.
But again, I think that's, what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, and it aligns perfectly with innovation, which is that we're shamed around creativity.
It's true.
Right? We're shamed around it. Societally, we're shamed around creativity. And so we have this, when I did that training on it, and one of the things I talked about is we have this media created imagery of what the creative is. And it's this person who is drug induced or alcohol induced, who's depressed and dark, and then has this burst of magnificent inspiration, and the lightnings of the gods and the muse come together, and they create this thing, and they spiral down into another dark moment until they find another one. And that's, again, a myth. It's got nothing to do with reality. It sells books, it sells movies, it's good for TV shows. But the truth of the matter is, there is a commitment to the meaning of something that is so deep and so powerful that I'm willing to go through the resistance that I face every single day, every day, multiple times a day as an artist. Because I said, I did a thing a while back on social media. I posted, I said, if you put on a business card what would never be there, what would it be? And mine said artist and philosopher. And I put mine out first, because philosopher, that's a bit woo-woo, right? Artist, that's a bit woo-woo. And I'm not seen as a woo-woo guy at all. But that's the truth. That's what inspires me. I'm looking at the world and trying to understand the world with a deep sense of philosophical understanding about the massive magnificence of it, and the tiny, infinitesimally small drivers of it, and the creation of it in its beauty and its light and its vocal deliciousness, the verbal of it all. And yet, okay, now how do we use this?
Yes. Yeah. And if you follow, I love what you're saying. And if you follow that through, if you find that thing that you just love to do because it intrinsically calls to you, for most people, or at least for me, it also means that I'm not doing it for the recognition of having done it. Now, if you are an innovator, if that's what should be on your title is actually chief marketing officer or, head of whatever, but actually it should be innovator. You pursue these innovations, and then someone takes them and brings them to market, and you're not even looking for the recognition, which is why it was so hard for me to find these internal innovators, because they often get forgotten, and they're okay with that. They're happy with the impact that they were able to create.
And that's a great point, because that is what I talked to you about when we spoke about this initially, which is how do you find these guys? Because they're often in the background. You know, one of the things I talk about in my work with dragon leaders, meaning-driven leaders, is the interesting thing about, you know, I said the distinction, one of the ways you recognize them is they have a ton of charisma, and they often will have a ton of charisma, and they'll often have that thing that is compelling is that they have incredible certainty. But there's a difference between certainty and arrogance. And arrogance can't bear curiosity, because you would question that. But certainty based on meaning, it's constantly curious. It wants to know more. It's always about knowing more. And therefore, there's not any attachment to the accolade. And so the interesting thing about a meaning-driven leader is that we don't need followers, but followers are compelled to that. And it's the same thing with this idea of innovating for the purpose of, this is my soul needs to express, and I've birthed this into the world, and actually I'll probably just move on now.
Yes, right.
And that's why I was struck. That's why when you first brought that to me, I thought, my God, that is quite the quest to find these people, because they're not standing on the corner going, look at me.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. They have some aspects that make them look like entrepreneurs. The research shows that they are creative thinkers. They understand the market. They're self-directed. They, take initiative. But they look different from entrepreneurs in that they are not risk-seeking. They like creating risk asymmetry, where you bet a little to potentially get a lot, because they're betting the companies might not their money. And they, as I said before, they love the politics. There's one big research study that said the number one differentiator between a successful internal innovator and a frustrated one is that the successful internal innovator views the political challenge as part of the problem-solving process. And so it's not like, I don't want to do the politics, but I need to. It is, oh, great, this 3D-dimensional like chess game that I'm playing, I'm excited to put in place, line up the cannon, so when they go off, they all at the same time, they make a big bang.
That's very cool. Yeah. This has been an amazing show. Great conversation, my friend. Thank you so much. Thank you. Before we finish, I would love for you to do two things. I'm going to ask you to do the first one last, and that is tell people about where they can find out more about you, your resources, the books, etc. But before we go there, I always like my guests to leave our show with our listeners, our viewers, with a real clear sense of something they can go do that's really practical in the next, 24, 48 hours, or preferably immediately, to take what you're saying and put it in action. What would that be?
So I would take a list of projects that you're working on and classify them as simply core and new, and look at what are one or two things that you can keep moving on that are new. Going back to your writing, right? It's so easy to get distracted by the important stuff that is immediate. But if you don't also invest some time in the stuff that's not important, or that's important but not yet urgent, right? So what are the one or two things on your agenda that you are going to commit spending 4 hours a week on that are the new things?
Very cool. That's really good. So again, this has been a wonderful conversation. I sincerely appreciate it. Please share with our viewers and our listeners where they can find out more about you and all of your resources, because I know there's a lot.
I think the best site is to go to www.kaihan.net, KAIHAN.net. You can also follow me on Twitter @Kaihan. Those are probably the two best places to find me.
Fabulous. And all the books are, of course, on Amazon and all the usual outlets. And so you can find them there. And of course, we will put everything in the show notes so you can make sure you can find Kaihan there. It's all available to you. Again, my friend, thank you so much. It's been a pure pleasure and a joy to have this conversation with you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I so enjoyed
staying with us to the end.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for you, dear listener, remember you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our LinkedIn or Facebook groups, just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. It doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your true capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or for your organization, go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Because unified meaning, or as we like to call it, finding your dragonfire, is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everyone you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about the amazing innovators inside of your organization that you need to just open the door and let the floodgates open that are just waiting for you. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your dragonfire to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.